Good afternoon, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody who is on Zoom. We have a lot of people on Zoom from our other offices. So you all know that I'm George Casey, Global Managing Partner of the firm, Ukrainian-American, proud Ukrainian, and I'm thrilled to welcome Dan Bilak, who is Canadian-Ukrainian, who has been now living in Ukraine and Kyiv for over 30 years. So Dan will talk to us about his experience in Ukraine. Most importantly, obviously, we'll be focusing on the ongoing war. And Dan has very multifaceted, probably the way I should put it, multifaceted experience in life in Ukraine as a practicing lawyer, 4 times in and out of the government, then, right? As chief investment advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine, the first chairman of Ukraine Invest, which was the agency that he actually suggested and founded, and then chaired, which is the government agency that is tasked with promoting investments in Ukraine. And then a number of other positions at the Ministry of Justice, a number of other positions. Practicing lawyer, currently chairman of Kyiv office, Ukraine practice of Kinstellar. Kinstellar as a multinational, international law firm. Used to be part of Linklaters quite some time ago, right? But for the last 14 years, it's a standalone international law firm. We do a lot of work with Kinstellar. Matt is here, who is an old friend. Currently chairman of Kinstellar, but still combining practice with actually serving in territorial defense. Dan was just recently awarded a medal by the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Reznikov, for his service and for his contribution to defending Ukraine and serving just outside of Kyiv, I guess. But you'll tell us more on that. But first of all, welcome. Right, I'm thrilled that you are here. Maybe just 2 words how difficult it is to get from Kyiv to New York these days. It used to be a direct flight, right? Yeah, so when did you arrive and how did you arrive?
Well, first of all, George, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you. And this is going to be, I suspect, more of a conversation because you have a lot of interesting perspectives and from your standpoint that personally I would find interesting. And but in terms of getting here, the Irish have a saying that you can't get there from here. And that's kind of how I feel from Kyiv these days. I'll never complain about the lineups at passport control at Boris Pil Airport again. That's for sure. It's about an 18-hour train ride from Kyiv to Warsaw, and from Warsaw there are good connections. So I actually flew directly to Toronto, which is where I'm from. I tell people I'm from a small Western Ukrainian village called Toronto. And so I was there giving a presentation yesterday, and then flew here. So yeah, but it's definitely worthwhile. It's we were just discussing before we came in here that it's a bit of sort of Alice through the looking glass kind of a feeling that you come out of this bubble, very intense bubble in Ukraine with a very particular vulnerabilities and sense of purpose and focus, and everybody is really all in on fighting this war. We have this notion of total resistance in Ukraine, where everybody is either on the front or working for the front, and every aspect of Ukrainian society is engaged in this process. From people who, like me, like you, who have volunteered for either the armed forces directly or for the territorial defense forces, which is a branch of the military and set up to defend, allow people to give them a chance to defend their own regions, to volunteers working on humanitarian, medical, and other affairs. Then you come here, and not everybody's obsessing and engaging about Ukraine 24/7. but yet you scratch the surface a little
the
bit,
huge,
and
huge
all of a
interest,
sudden there's
yeah.
this huge outpouring of interest and really confusion to a large extent about what's
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah, no, huge support, and yeah, I thank everybody here at the firm for all the support that I personally have received and the interest and support for Ukraine. It's been tremendous. What I thought then, the way we structure our conversation, probably let's talk a little bit about the war itself, right, and what's happening. Maybe a little bit of history of Russia-Ukraine relationship. I'll say that I believe that the world has learned more about Ukraine over the last 11 months than probably some people knew for many years before that. I remember the time when I came to the US, still from the Soviet Union, and people would say, where are you from? And I would say, I'm Ukrainian. And people say, oh, so you're Russian. No, I'm Ukrainian. So there was very little understanding, no confusion these days, of course. So we'll touch a little bit on that. Then the second piece that would be interesting to cover is kind of geopolitics around Ukraine. What's happening, where there is support, where there is misunderstanding, where there's maybe misalignment in geopolitical environment and support that Ukraine is getting, or sometimes complaining that it's not getting, right? And then the third piece, given your multifaceted involvement, particularly with the government and investments, as for all of us, professional lawyers, and by the way, a lot of clients are asking this question. So, okay, the war at some point will end. What's the investment opportunity in Ukraine? Is there investment environment? I've written about this. I've been speaking to Ukrainian community, Ukrainian business community, lawyers, finance, government people, how Ukraine should position itself for investments, but obviously would love your perspective on that. So kind of three big buckets, if you will, if that's okay with you. So maybe let's start with kind of just as a premise. So February 24th last year, first day of invasion, where were you, your family, how this all unfolded, and then Kyiv was under direct attack, so I guess that's when you got involved with territorial defense and you were actually on the front line. So maybe can you talk about sort of that time period?
Yeah, it's interesting because all of that sort of was a blur until the anniversary date last month, and then it was sort of, you have these, like looking through a photo album, and you've got very clear pictures of what happened that day. Like millions of other Ukrainians, we were all woken up to the sound of artillery fire at 5 a.m. I don't know how many of you have ever served in the armed forces and heard artillery fire, but it's quite a fearsome sound. It's not one that we as humans are generally programmed. Loud thunderstorms, I mean, that's about as close as you can possibly get. But that there is not just rain coming behind the thunder, that it's going to be raining missiles, and you don't really know what to expect. And it's that whole initial shock and fear and uncertainty. And I was one of the probably handful of people in Ukraine that actually anticipated that we were going to be having a war. So luckily, I went out and started buying kit back in December when you could still find it.
Can you talk about that actually? Because you not only organized yourself, you organized actually other people around you. You started training way before, several months before, right?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. It was a bit quixotic. I have zero military experience. I was probably I never fired a rifle before. Now, I've got an automatic Kalashnikov and an AR-15. I mean, I could be, an NRA representative in Ukraine. Be a lot of them actually these days. But I got very interested. The Minister of Defense is a friend of mine, Alexei Reznikov, and a colleague by profession. He's a brilliant lawyer and been friends for many, many years. And when he became minister back in November of 2021, and I asked him, well, what can I do to help you? And he says, well, we're really struggling now because the law takes effect on January 1, establishing the territorial defense forces, and nothing's been done to prepare. And I said, oh, okay. So I went to my region and to the recruiting office, and we started talking to them. I wanted to sign up, and they said, well, you know, we don't have anything to sign up with because we're not really, it hasn't been created, it hasn't taken effect. I said, okay, so what do you need? And he looked at me and goes, well, we have nothing. And literally, so I started saying, okay, well, you know, we can maybe start sourcing some things, but you know, you don't really have a context of what of how to do this. So we started actually some local training with people in my village, in my community outside of Kiev. Found a former major in the armed forces, and we'd go out on Saturdays, and of course we wouldn't be using weapons or anything because you know we didn't have the right to do that at that time.
So this is December of
this was
21.
the end of December, beginning of January.
So you know, to remind everybody, right, what was happening at that time. So Russia was accumulating their forces on the border with Ukraine, and it was getting from 25,000 to 50,000 to 125,000. They were moving airplanes to the border. I think by the time of invasion, they had something like 200,000 troops on the border. And so in December, kind of the world was watching what's happening, and people were speculating: is it just Putin bluffing? Is he trying to, you know, get something for this? But that's the time when you were actually preparing the unit, working with territorial defense to prepare for the invasion.
It was exactly, and you could really feel that with that pressure. It was really psychological pressure. In fact, I rationally, it made no sense for him to invade. If he had just parked his troops where he had them and just stood there, he would have wrecked the country. Within 2 years, we would have been completely wrecked. I was already hearing it from clients about, well, you know, we're going to hold off on our investments in Ukraine because of the risk, etc. The psychological game. He was, you know, he's a KGB agent. His entire life is a special operation, right? And but this time, you know, he's had that ideological drive. You know, people say he's the reincarnation of Peter the First, or he thinks he is. He's actually the spawn of Stalin. And this is, you know, if you look at a map of what Stalin basically conquered at the end of the Second World War, that's in my mind what he was going to recreate, and that included the NATO countries, the Baltics, the East Germany, etc., and it's farther. People like Putin and other dictators, you know, people ask me, how far is he going to go? And I said, as far as you're going to let him. You know, it's up to the West to draw those lines. And if you're continuing to appease somebody, the appetite only grows. They never back down. I mean, people keep expecting it. It's never happened in the history of the world. So we started doing this little organization. It was quite amateurish, etc. But I mean, you know, there was this sense that you had to do something. We weren't just going to sit around and wait. And then January 1st rolled around, and we started the formation. You know, we had in our battalion, our Territorial Defense Force Battalion, had 550 places. We had only by the second week of February filled 350 of those. And so we still had another 150 to fill. By the second week after the invasion, we had filled all of those, and we were turning people away. And the lineups were going like a kilometer down the street from people who were coming to sign up. But they were dressed. I mean, I look like Rambo compared to what these people were dressed in. I mean, you guys look like Rambo compared to what these people were dressed in. And I just stood there and I just thought, oh my God. And so we started. I worked with a group called the Ukrainian Freedom Fund to start sourcing. It was headed by former U.S. Marines who have been in Ukraine for many years, Andy Bain and Nico Woods and others. And we started sourcing helmets and body armor and IFAKs, the battlefield medicine kits for each soldier, just so people could feel that they had and to protect them. And you know, you mentioned my time in government, and a lot of it was most of it was reforms and policy work, very high level institution building and all that stuff that gets measured in decades in terms of impact. I can tell you that nothing compares to handing your neighbor or your neighbor's neighbor body armor and a helmet and seeing the look on their face at that granular level that, wow, I might survive the first volley. We also had, I mean, I'm eternally grateful to my partners at Kinstellar, throughout the firm, throughout our offices in Central and Eastern Europe. Everybody rallied. Because I anticipated this happening, and from my experience, I had been a managing partner at another law firm during the Maidan Revolution, where we had to we put together an evacuation plan. I spoke with our senior partner, Jason Moog, and I said, Jason, we gotta do something. And so we were able to activate getting people out of difficult places when the invasion actually took place, and getting families to safety. We had to do a couple of extractions, getting people out of already occupied territories. But that first 2 weeks was just the most intense thing I've ever experienced in my life. And because you just don't know what's going to be happening day to day. The news you're getting is sort of episodic, and you're hearing about this, and you're hearing about troops coming down in armored columns, and you hear they're coming from the east along the road into my region, and coming down from the north. And you're dealing with people who've never had the training. And when you look at the territorial defense forces in places like Sumy and Kharkiv and Kherson, they were just thrown into the mix right away with the armed forces. What we started doing was we worked with the special forces group, taking volunteers from our battalion and our volunteer units at the village level up to Brovary, which is just northeast of Kyiv, and just north of our region, just to get a sense of what it's like to be in a battle and to see how people react. Can we rely on these folks? We weren't frontline, but we were, carrying boxes of ammunition and missiles and, launchers and things.
So that's when Russia actually invaded.
That's right.
So maybe again, reminding everybody. So the invasion started, and they started moving towards Kyiv very quickly. And Kyiv, they were approaching Kyiv from north.
From both sides.
From both
of the
sides. So the Dnieper River goes almost through the middle of the country, north to south. And so they were approaching from Belarus border and Russian border going down. And so that's when you and your teammates in this unit moved up north from Kyiv to actually be with the troops that were defending Kyiv at that time?
We were, by this time, it was all being formed on the hoof, as it were, but we were subordinate to the battalion, the formal battalion. But it was just sort of this mass of people. I was an advisor to the military administration, the head of the military administration of my region. And so, at least I could see the bigger picture through that involvement. And this idea was that, look, we got to get people ready for what might happen, and let's just at least start getting them into the battlefield. You smell the cordite, you hear the booming, you hear the small arms fire. Out of about 50 volunteers that had gone up, I think only 2 couldn't handle it. Everybody else said, we want to go back.
Yeah.
And George, that sort of total resistance, that desire to defend your country at all costs has not waned to this day. That's the incredible part.
So let's talk why, right? Because on the anniversary of invasion, I posted on LinkedIn sort of my description of what this war is about.
I reposted it.
Thank you. So let's talk why, because that's actually for many people this war was probably as much of a surprise as anything. And then some people still in the U.S. and other parts of the world describe it as, well, it's a regional quote unquote conflict. So it needs to sort itself out. Russians and Ukrainians need to learn how to live together. So those type of comments. So in my post, I described the war in 5 pieces. So if you agree with that description, maybe let's take them apart and talk about them. One, it's colonial war. It's colonialism against the country that wants to be independent. So it's one piece. Totalitarianism against democracy. That's the other piece. Chauvinism, and I put actually chauvinism and cultural appropriation against the nation that
100%
preserved its language and heritage and culture for centuries, right? That it's the war of lies against truth and then evil against good. So maybe taking with colonialism, and I'll be sharing my perspective as you are sharing your perspective. Let's start there, because I think that's the piece that probably for many people, both surprising, but also not everybody understands it. The way I look at it, and I'd love your perspective. What probably is causing confusion is when you look at colonial empires over the history, right? Typically, the colonial power is in one place, the colonies are somewhere else, far away, right? What is confusing about Russia, what we call Russia, that huge, vast piece of land, right? Those huge, vast territories, that's actually colonies that are adjacent to the colonial power, and that's what causes confusion. The world is used to calling that entire piece Russia, but actually, when you break it down, it's a colonial empire. But by the way, if I may, before I let you comment,
no, keep going. This
ask,
is great. I don't have to do the explaining. This is unique.
I'll throw this question to the audience, right? Just out of curiosity, how many ethnicities are in Russia? So, any other views? So Matt is I've heard slightly lower number, but it's in that zip code, right? So we are talking about, let's call it 200 roughly, right? 200 ethnicities, right? We call them Russians. We call that Russia, but it's the same thing as take British colonial empire or French colonial empire and call everybody in the colonized, in the places where the indigenous people were colonized, call them, British or French, right? So that's the big piece that I think was causing confusion over time. If you look at the large ethnic groups, they're not even Slavic, right? It's people of ethnic backgrounds that have nothing to do with Slavs. You have Mongolic ethnic groups, you have Turkic ethnic groups. Those are actually the largest after Russian ethnicity within Russia. And so again, to me, that confusion about Russia, and then Russia, of course, says that, well, Ukraine was always ours. Ukrainians are Russians, they just speak funny language, kind of vernacular dialect.
The Russians can't understand.
And so I'll ask you to comment, and then I'll jump in back as well.
It's so refreshing to talk to somebody that I don't have to explain this stuff. But it's a great segue, because I think that George, that you hit the nail on the head. One of the things that really struck me, and I'll just finish with the previous commentary, that struck me leading up to the war, because I was following obviously what was being said in Ukraine, but I was also following the Western press. I was just stunned by all the experts and people who are all Russia experts, and all of them saying Kyiv will be rolled in 3 days. Ukraine will collapse within 2 to 3 weeks. We are looking at a Russian administration within a month. And I'm sitting here listening to this and reading this, going, this ain't gonna happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I live here. This is not going to happen. And what it really comes down to is picking up on your point, is that everybody has bought into the Russian propaganda over centuries. And even the experts, which are Russia experts, for some reason, being a so-called Russia expert makes you automatically a Ukraine expert. And that just shows the fact that, you don't have a lot of these political scientists, all of them in think tanks and things like that. So my takeaway was that the experts generally have had this wrong, even to this day. When I hear Western experts saying, well, Ukraine doesn't need the arms because of this, they're looking at numbers on a spreadsheet. They're not looking at, what we say in Ukrainian, boyovy duch. They're not looking at the fighting spirit.
Yeah.
They're not looking at the history, the fact that Ukrainians have historically resisted the colonialization of Russia. And what Russia has done really, really effectively over centuries is that it has created this notion that Russia is a nation state. Russia is not a nation state, as you just pointed out. Russia is a colonial empire. In fact, there was no Russia until Peter I. Russia became Russian Empire in 1729. Up until that point in time, it was Muscovy. And when Kyiv, the princes of Kyiv, Volodymyr the Great, Prince Vladimir, as they call him in Russian, took Christianity from Constantinople, he took it to bind the Kievan state, which in the 10th century was the largest empire in Europe, to bind it to Europe, to modernity, to moving forward, because Constantinople was the capital of the world at the time. Rome was laid to waste. And Moscow was a bog. It wasn't even a settlement for another 150 years. So what are we talking about? Right? And it comes to that cultural and historical. I just finished because this picks up on your point. The historical appropriation. My recommendation to everybody has been throughout this war: don't read the experts from the think tanks. Read the historians. Timothy Snyder, Serhiy Plokhy, or commentators like Anne Applebaum, Timothy Gartnash from Oxford, who's a historian. They got it. They understand. They've put this conflict into its proper historical context in a very popular way that allows people to understand how this affects their lives today. Timothy Snyder has a great line. He says, Russia does not have history. Russia has propaganda. And in fact, it's denied its own history, which is tied to the Mongol horde, the Golden Horde. I mean, that's the genesis of the Russian. If you look at the early Russian emperors, they were all dressed like the Mongol Khan. And they were there, even the Russian entire administrative lexicon, dengi, which is money, kazna, kaznacheystvo, kazna, which is the treasury. These are all Mongol words. And it was a reverse takeover, essentially. So this great myth of Ivan the Terrible throwing off the yoke of oppression from the Mongol Tartar hordes is a myth, because what it was basically said, why am I paying these guys a 10% tithe when now I have a bigger army and whatever, I'm not paying this anymore, and basically destroyed them.
So maybe, just to build on the point you made on to put some dates in perspective, right? So Kyiv, for the first time, is mentioned in historical chronicles in 482, right? Moscow was founded in 1167. So you have, 700 years that there was no fiefdom of Muscovy. It started 700 years later. The other point you made, also an important point for everybody to understand, that the word Russia is actually cultural appropriation, exactly. Right? Because Kievan Rus was called Rus. What Russia is trying to do through its propaganda is to connect to it and say that Kievan Rus is the predecessor state to modern Russia, as opposed to saying that they appropriated the history and appropriated the name. There were several Rus, actually, in plural, Kievan Rus the largest. And so when Moscow Tsar started calling themselves Tsar of all Rus, what they were trying to do is to say that because they captured all those lands, they are now Tsars, they are the main landlord for that entire territory of what were independent states of Rus. So maybe just a little bit more perspective on the colonial part of this war, and we can go into other aspects that we even touched on. So colonization of Ukraine, really, the most recent iteration of colonization started in 1654 when Ukraine and Russian Tsars at the time, signed effectively a war military cooperation treaty to fight common threats. What that turned into, it was the first step in many later steps in colonizing Ukraine, and it coincided. Peter the Great, Peter the First, we don't call him the Great, but Peter the First came to power just a little bit, few decades after that treaty was signed. And so the history actually shows how Peter's view of expanding Russia was effectively the colonial wars. He fought the war in Caucasus. That's how the nations in Caucasus were captured, Chechens, among others. So if anybody is interested, we can talk about that as well. Moving up north, so the Baltic states were captured under Peter I and became part of Russia, and Ukraine was colonized gradually. I'll just say, one other piece of this, that brutality of that of those colonial wars can be described by one episode, probably most precisely. 1709, there was Ukrainian military units were fighting together with Swedes against Russia. 1709, they lose a particular battle. Peter I goes to the city of Baturin, which is the main seat for an elected, and we'll come to it, an elected leader of Ukraine at the time. 14,000 people killed, civilians, kids, women killed, 14,000 people. The brutality, you can only compare what Putin is doing today and his regime to that destruction of Baturin, to punish civilian population for the fact that Ukrainian military units were cooperating with Swedes in that particular part of the northern war that Peter I was fighting. 14,000 people, right? Entire city was destroyed. So let's maybe.
If I could just add a few things, because this is such an important point. In fact, this is the fundamental point, that what is happening today is not about Putin. This is as George has just so explicitly and eloquently outlined. This has been going on for hundreds of years. This is how the Russians fight, because there's an ideological component to this. It's not just a land grab. It's about the Mongol absolutist Khan type of system of governance, if you like, is exactly what the Russians adopted. And exactly because they had it before. They destroyed Tver and Novgorod, which were actually cities in Russia that were part of the Hanseatic League. They actually had their own, they had Magdeburg law, they had elected representatives, and they were just wiped out by the Muscovites. And so this absolutist brutality of repression as a mode of government is exactly what the Russian Tsars and the Russian Empire and the Russian state and the Russian Empire adopted. And that's exactly what we are witnessing today. What happened in Bucha, what happened in Irpin, what happened in Izium, what happened in Kherson, what happened in Mariupol, what happened in Chernihiv is just another line of genocide on a long continuum of genocidal acts. And because of Russia's size and because of its ostensible strength, European countries, even if they were monarchies, etc., they were still organized in a different way. There was still degrees of personal freedom of such as my sister, the historian, is going to jump up and tell me that's not true. But it was a different mentality, a different mindset, especially after the Enlightenment. They never got the Enlightenment. They never went through that. Peter was a great modernizer, they said. Well, he just wanted things to work differently because his country was so crap. And it didn't fit into the rest of Europe. And he liked the way, but he was aghast when he sat in the British Parliament and he heard the debate. How can they talk about the monarch this way? What? He said, I'd have them all killed. Yeah. And so this is exactly why Vladimir Putin, euhemerizes Peter the First, and Stalin was a great manager. Yeah, he managed the deaths of 30 million people. Yeah. And so this historical context is very important. And Ukraine in this context is absolutely critical to the understanding, the ideological underpinnings of this, because Zbigniew Brzezinski, I really, really nailed it in 1991. He said, with Ukraine, Russia will always be an aggressive empire that will threaten the vital interests of the West and the United States of America. Without Ukraine, Russia has a chance of becoming a normal nation state or a regional power. I don't know about the last part because I think the colonial mentality is still makes it very aggressive. But Ukraine is the key because there's no Europe in Russia without Ukraine, and so you need to appropriate. It's a great framework, George. Both the history of Rus, Ukrainian, the historical Ukrainian lands, and the ideology of control over those people. also need to understand that there's no such thing as a Russian. We call them Russians in English. There's actually two words for Russians. There's Ruski, which they consider ethnic Russians, and therefore the direct descendants of Kievan Rus, and Rossiane, which are the citizens of the Russian Federation. That's the Buryats, the Kalmyks, the Mordovians, all the 250 ethnicities and tribes, 140 along the old Volga River alone, all destroyed, all culturally appropriated. They were told, you are not who you are actually Russians. And we're here to help you understand that. And if you don't understand that, we will kill you and your families and your children and everybody else. So this has just been going on. And the interesting part is the great colonizer of Russia wasn't even Russian. She was a German princess, Catherine the Great as well. There's something about these great people that isn't so great if you're living under them. Yeah. So anyway, I think that this is a really important this part of the conversation does not make it into many conversations, and it's because people don't understand, like, why are they doing this? Why can't they all just get along? Why don't you negotiate? And it has a policy, a very, very insidious policy aspect to it, because the reflex is, my latte costs 20% more. Why don't they just negotiate? Let's just get this war over with and, give up some Ukrainian territory and he'll go away. No, that's not a peace. That's a pause.
And so maybe just to add to what you just said, Chechnya is a perfect example of what it means that they do not go away. So those of you who follow, the history and remember the history. So the first Chechnya war was 1992. So Chechnya tried to become independent just as Ukraine became independent the year earlier in 1991. Ukraine became independent. 92, Chechnya tries to be independent. Russia comes and says absolutely not, and launches brutal war, loses in 1992. The country of 140 million loses to a nation of 1 million. Chechnya wins in 92. Russia goes away, regroups, comes back. This time they come back so that there's nobody left who can fight.
Level everything.
Destroy Grozny, the capital city of Chechnya, to the point where there were no buildings left, right? Put their own stooge, right? And that person now is in charge. So, and how colonial empires work. So 20 years later, all those young Chechens who were born and brainwashed and kept under this tight control, so those Chechens are now put into Russian uniform and sent to fight against Ukraine. Why Brzezinski made the point that he made, Ukraine, the nation of 45 million people, you take those young Ukrainians, put them into Russian uniform and send them to Baltics, send them elsewhere. That's how colonial empires work. That's what the Russian imperialist mentality, how that works. Switching maybe from the colonial nature to...
Just to finish on this point, highly recommend for those of you who have a Sunday morning over a period of weeks or months, is Timothy Snyder's lecture series on the history of Ukraine. It's online. It's got 10 million viewers. This is the most popular history course probably in the history of history. And it's just everybody. I mean, I'm surprised at the people I meet that have actually
they watch it,
taken the course, and there's not even an exam.
Yeah, Timothy Snyder is a Yale professor who teaches history of Ukraine. He is not Ukrainian, but this has been his area of study for many years. So switching to another maybe subtopic, and then we'll move on. Totalitarianism versus democracy. The point that I think surprises a lot of people, Russia, if you look at Russia, it has never been a democracy. Even if you take Yeltsin's years in the 90s, that's not real democracy, how Putin became president of Russia, right? So there was
anointed.
There was no democracy. Ukraine actually had a democratically elected representative back in 1650s all the way until 1722. Ukrainians were electing their leader. That democracy, which again surprises many, because you would not think that in that part of the world you would have a thriving democracy. People traditionally, historically, the reason why we saw Maidan, we saw all this strong involvement by civil society in Ukraine over the last 30 years and going back, it's because there is this very strong democratic tradition. How democracy ended in Ukraine under, again, Peter I. In 1722, he, I guess, concluded that he's had enough of it, right? So one, he banned the Ukrainian language, and we'll come to it in a moment. Most importantly, he banned elections. And instead of the elected leaders, Ukraine got designated something called Malorossiyskaya Kollegia, which stands for the Council of Little Russia. And here it would be even particularly interesting that the word Little Russia, which is Malorossiya, stands for, basically was the term for Ukraine. And Ukrainians will refer to as Little Russians. The term for Russian people was Great Russians, Velikorossi, Malorossi, Great Russians, Little Russians. Talking about just completely reducing a nation of, currently 5 million people to nothing, right? Those little people. But comment maybe on this then, and particularly the democratic traditions that survived all these years of suppression, and how you see it, what you saw during Maidan, because again, people were surprised during the Maidan, by civil society engagement against actually people who were shooting at them.
I mean, this, and you've really unpacked a super topic, and I think this is the ideological essence of what is happening right now, is the whole notion of freedom, and the fact that freedom isn't free, and that you actually have to fight for it. And Ukrainians have been fighting for their freedom, for self-determination, the right to make their own choices, to choose their own destinies, which way they want to go. And Ukrainians always have chosen Europe. Ukraine is a European nation and has always felt part of the Ukrainian nation. Most of its interaction historically was with the Poles, with the Lithuanians, and with Constantinople, with the Byzantine Empire. As you pointed out, the interaction with Russia came relatively late, in the 18th century. And so you get a lot of that historical appropriation, but that the essence of the freedom is so important that, and this is something that when I hear Americans say, you should negotiate, it's almost a betrayal of the essence of what it is to be an American, in my own humble Canadian view. I won the grade 13 American History Award in high school, so I'm an expert. And I think this is really important because, as I think it's the New Hampshire license plate says, live free or die. And it's such a fundamental aspect to being American is the notion that there are some things worth dying for. You go to Europe, you talk to people, there's nothing worth dying for. You just negotiate. Somehow it's all good. We'll get together, we'll have a coffee, we'll work it out. Well, no, you don't work it out. You're dealing with a colonialist, aggressive, genocidal, terrorist state. I think the English language is going to run out of epithets and adjectives to describe Russia pretty soon. But in the Ukrainian national anthem, the key part of the refrain is, we will lay down our souls and bodies for our freedom. And this is not just a set of words. This is a pact.
And that's the reason why Ukrainians are fighting. Oath. Yeah.
And when and where does it come from? We're lawyers. Actually, I kind of somebody explained it to me, and as lawyers we should understand this. When we looked at the rule of law, when we looked at studied the rule of law, the genesis of the rule of law, not dicey, but where did it all start? We trace it back to the Magna Carta. Okay, Magna Carta, gets a lot of mythology around it, but fundamentally, it was a pact between some elites that just said, leave us alone, do our own thing, we'll enslave our in our feudal system the way we want to. But it also meant that there was certain rules, and it governed the relationship between people and their land. And even when you became a landowner, you have the right to that piece of land. That is your ownership. And there is the entire court system, the king's courts after the invasion by the Normans were set up to basically solve land problems. And in Ukrainian, the word for ownership coming from the land, the The freedom is fundamentally, like it is in the United States, about what you own. It's about the freedom to alienate, hold, alienate, and use what is yours. And the word for ownership in Ukrainian is privatna vlastnost. That is something private that is integral to yourself as part of you, that you can use, abuse, and other things. Then when you look at Russian, what the Russian word for ownership is частная собственность, part of a whole. So the entire colonial regime's relationship to land and ownership and goods, they don't own anything. They don't have skin in the game. They're slaves. They get what they have from above. And that's why you have the worship of the Tsar, the Khan. And so this notion of freedom is fundamentally tied to the Ukrainian relationship to the land. And when you sing Ukrainian songs and you read Ukrainian poetry, it's all about the land. It's all about our sacred, God-given land. And when you read the stories of the soldiers on the front lines, when you read about and their testimonies, and these are simple people. These are the average, people that live in my village. They have small businesses. They might be mechanics. They might be farmers, whatever. It's all very simple to them. It's all about protecting our land. What is ours? They have theirs, and they've got lots of it. Leave it to them, and let's. Before February 24th, nobody hated Russians. Okay, a lot of people hated Russians, but it wasn't. Nobody wanted, and we don't want their land. Ukrainians have invaded nobody in their history. Okay, that's pretty unique.
That's actually an important point, right? Ukraine happens to be on the crossroads and many people were crossing over the centuries, Ukraine, or trying to capture parts of Ukraine. Ukraine as such has not invaded other countries. And what's interesting, even during this war, when you listen to military leaders in Ukraine or to Zelensky, nobody says that we want to cross the border with Russia and go fight all the way to Moscow. Everybody says we want to get to our borders and get what's ours back, and then we don't need anybody else's. Let's maybe talk a little bit, touching on this. Putin's pretext for invasion. One of them is he came to protect Russian speakers. By the way, Hitler went to protect German speakers in Czechoslovakia in 1938. How Russian propagandists do not see those parallels kind of bewilders me, but let's set that aside. But so coming to protect Russian speakers, there was never somebody who grew up in Ukraine. There was never animosity towards Russian speakers. Actually, Russian language was dominant language, and I'll explain in a second why. There was, and up till now, also against Russian speakers or Russian people living in Ukraine, there are a lot of Russian people, Russian ethnically or Russian speakers fighting on the front line. When you watch videos from the front line, probably half of those videos actually soldiers speaking Russian to each other or speaking Russian, these two guys speaking Russian and then that guy speaks Ukrainian. That was never an issue. But why the language actually is, Russian language is so widely spoken in Ukraine. So when Peter started putting his foot down on Ukraine, this is also going to 1721, he banned the Ukrainian language as language of official communication in Ukraine. He banned publishing of any books in Ukrainian. The fact that the language survived these 350 years is because, one, it was widely spoken in the countryside, but as importantly, historians, poets, writers, philosophers were writing in Ukrainian specifically to preserve the language over these 350 years that Ukraine was colonized. I will say more. In 1970s, 80s, there were a handful of schools in Kyiv, in the capital, that were actually teaching in Ukrainian. I had to commute from age 7 to age 18, 1 hour each way to go to a Ukrainian language school because there were no Ukrainian language schools in the capital. So what happens with the language? Of course, that when people go to school, that's the language they're taught in. Of course, they come out, they speak Russian, and so pretty much everybody in Ukraine speaks Russian. There's no question about it. Even in Ukrainian language schools, so you would come out on the street, you will be with your friends. If you speak Ukrainian, you will get a glance from a passerby, like what's wrong with you. If you display the two colors of the Ukrainian flag, or there is a tripod, which is the ancient Asian going to Kievan Rus Ukrainian symbol of statehood. If you display that, you would go to jail. This is we're talking 1970s, 80s, right? This is not Stalin's times. So that suppression of culture, language, of heritage has been severe. The fact that Ukrainians saved the language and that language is now thriving is almost a miracle over these years. The only other point I will make on cultural heritage: Ukraine is actually a multi-ethnic nation, and goes back centuries to the time when Ukraine started to exist, because there were many different tribes coexisting and living together, and continue actually now during modern Ukraine continue to live together. I just watched the other day a video produced by mayor of Athens in Greece about Greeks in Ukraine. Fascinating video, talking about Greek heritage in Ukraine, and Greek Ukrainians. Mariupol, which is an old Greek settlement. So
Crimea.
Anything then you'd
yeah,
like to...
I think this historical excursus is really important, because it goes to the heart of why he came into Ukraine and why he needs to be defeated here, and why you can't negotiate with him. Because this idea of Malorosse and Ukrainian language, and the idea that the Russian language is so dominant and we have to protect the Russian speakers, is something that the Poles went through, that the Balts went through, and it is part of the imperial impulse. And so long as that is the justification for this war, he's not going to stop. And a peace is going to be a pause, because, I mean, aside from the fact he's now in so far, he will always double down. The KGB never loses, right? It just keeps going, and he'll throw as many bodies as he can into the mix in order to overwhelm in his mind anyway. So I think that the issue of the Ukrainian language has now become an identity issue. It wasn't, and it frustrated me as a Ukrainian Canadian, frustrated me for 30 years. Because it drove me crazy listening to Ukrainians who speak perfect Ukrainian speaking to each other and to others in Russian. And I said to them, I said, look, you are essentially, the language you speak is a language of choice. And if you speak two languages, using one as the dominant tells me everything, and your interlocutor, everything you need to know about what you think about the second one. So there was this particular mentality that had been very successful in drilling into Ukrainians' minds that they were second-class citizens, that they were colonials, that the Russians were the dominant people. And this was very, very pronounced when I came to Ukraine in 1991 for the first time. It started to evolve as the history opened up, and the Orange Revolution was the first sort of explosion of national identity, and then the Maidan. But the Maidan, again, wasn't an all-Ukrainian event. It was very much Kyiv-based. It had a very strong ideological support from Western Ukraine, which did not have the Soviet experience, except since 1945, 1939, I guess. But its formative basis was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and where there was much more, the Austrians were great at divide and conquer. So they let the Ukrainians speak Ukrainian to keep the Poles in their place and that kind of stuff. So, but this notion that somehow the language I speak is part of my identity is now become very pronounced. And you hear it's really when you go to in Kyiv and you go to gatherings and you hear people talking about speaking in Russian, it's like, oh my God, you know what's it's changing dramatically. But you're right, and what it comes back to the notion of land and ownership, that when the Donbass was invaded in 2014, the bulk of the resistance were from local people. 90%
resistance against the Russian
against the
invasion
Russians,
back then.
were
Exactly.
all of whom were Russians, almost all of whom were Russian speakers. Now, Russian was primarily spoken in the cities. Even in eastern Ukraine, people spoke Ukrainian or a hybrid Ukrainian-Russian called Surzhyk, but the basis was Ukrainian.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's very important. Because behind the Russian language is this notion of Russian world, Ruski mir. And that's really what they're pushing forward, is that the Russian world, it's a civilizational battle that he's waging. And Ruski mir is supposed to unite all Russian-speaking people under the Tsar in Russia. Dzhokhar Dudayev, actually the first president of Chechnya after independence, and a great supporter of Ukraine and great observer of Ukraine, said, Ruski mir, Russian world, is sitting up to your neck in crap and trying to drag the rest of the world in with you. And that is probably the best analogy that I have heard, and why the world, and the United States in particular, that whose vital interests are a Europe whole, at peace, and free, should be really concerned about leaving Putin on any part of Ukrainian territory.
So it's a perfect segue. Let's talk about the geopolitics around Ukraine. So a lot of discussions over the last 12 months, what to do, and we touched in our conversation on some of this. Should Ukraine just negotiate and give away some land, and this is going to bring peace to everybody? What's the perception, your personal perception and perception in Ukraine, in support that Ukraine has been receiving? By the way, tremendous support from United States. It's amazing what's been done. But at the same time, people are saying that it's not enough. So how would you describe it? And maybe let's go even into a little bit of statistics that you and I know about how much of military budget is spent, and U.S. military budget spent in Ukraine and so forth.
This is really the key issue for, I think, right now, because you hear in the United States, certainly certain parts of the Republican Party in particular, that why are we with the blank check that we're giving Ukrainians? It's open-ended. It costs, we could be building a border wall with Mexico instead of supporting these Ukrainians. It's not really our fight anyway. And this is just so wrong. And it's so wrong on a number of different areas. I call it the issues of agency, appeasement, and aggression. So agency is the easiest one. It means that, if you're saying, well, just give up part of your land. It's always great. It's easy to give up somebody else's property, right? And it means that the Ukrainians have no agency. The fact that 89% of Ukrainians have said that they will fight to the last breath, even if Putin uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, doesn't mean anything in that argument, because, just give up some land and he'll go away. But he's not going to go away, and we've already unpacked that he's going to pause and he's going to come back. He's going to come back for, this is the aggression part, that he's going to, it's really appeasement, because you're appeasing a dictator. And so this is against vital American interests, because it means everybody's watching. What does that signal to Iran? What does that signal to China? What does that signal to your other strategic competitors and enemies about American resolve to stand up for the defense of freedom and principles and self-determination and all the things that it claims are fundamental to the Western alliance? And it just completely eliminates that. And then there's the aggression part, is that he's going to come back and he's going to go take the rest of Ukraine, and he's going to go into Poland, and he's going to the Baltic states. And that means American soldiers die, because all of a sudden that's now a wider war. That's a NATO war. Even now, when we're hearing that China is looking to send Russia lethal weapons, that takes this out of the European theater and makes this conflict. It makes a global conflict, and it increases the chance, letting a rampant Putin, because now he's got America on the ropes. And Russian identity, because they don't have an identity, because they are a colony, they don't have a unifying identity in the country. The unifying identity is always having an enemy. And he needs, as a KGB agent, he needs to have an enemy to have any value in his, raison d'etre. And the enemy is America. And so now what is being, and this is why you read the Telegram channels. I mean, it's unfortunate that many of your colleagues don't read Russian. Well, it's probably fortunate because you wouldn't be able to stomach it. But it's they're all in on this. This is not a Putin war. And even though the death rate is just astronomical in Russia, people are doubling down. Well, you know what? If we have to send our sons to die, then for the cause, and so they will just continue to come, and then that's a real challenge. America and the NATO alliance has never had an opportunity like this one. At the Madrid conference of NATO recently, the NATO allies recognized that the greatest threat to NATO and to democratic countries is Russia. So we have recognized that that's enemy number one. They think that NATO and the United States are enemy number one. There is a recipe for conflict. The United States, for 50 cents a day to each one of you and all of your compatriots, gets to fight a war against Russia without losing a single American life. That's a good deal. We do the fighting, we do the dying. Just give us the arms, give us what we need in the quantities and in the time frame that we need it. We know we can get this job done. Even when I listen to CNN and NBC and Fox, and you have all the generals and the president and others saying, Ukrainians don't need this. Our generals or our people have gamed this out. You don't need this. We know our enemy. And as George said, there are multi-levels to this. This is not about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is about being able to be smarter, more efficient. We've used the equipment that we've got from the United States, and thank God for the United States of America. Thank God for the people of the United States of America, because we would be toast. They would already be in Berlin today if it was not for you. But this is an opportunity this war is costing NATO countries 0.01% of the GDP of these countries. This has got to be the best investment you will ever make.
Or what, 3.5% of US military budget,
it's
right?
3.2% of the Pentagon's budget.
And Pentagon's budget is set for decades, right, to address exactly this kind of threat, right? And for 3.5% of that budget, 50% of conventional forces, Russian conventional forces destroyed. 97% of Russian armed forces are tied in Ukraine. This is
this is a crucial point. What you just said is a crucial point. We have already destroyed, I'll repeat what George just said, 50% of the Russian military capability in 1 year with your help. Why would this not be a good thing? Why would we not want to weaken Russia to the point where it no longer poses a threat to European security, where it no longer poses an aggressive threat to the neighbors? This thing about escalation and nuclear war, etc., so many red lines where they've rattled the nuclear saber have been crossed that he's not going to do this. He would have to have a calculation that his nuclear weapons, first, that they work, which is going to be a big issue, but that they are actually going to give him more of a benefit than what he's going to lose, because he's been told that he will be faced with overwhelming conventional resistance by the United States and NATO if he uses even tactical nuclear weapons. There's no real gain for him to do this. And using tactical nukes is not going to defeat the Ukrainian military, because they are only effective against very large assemblies of soldiers. We don't fight that way. We fight in much smaller units.
And that's, your point on escalation is so important, right? The way Western governments think is that, okay, we give more advanced weapons, it's going to be escalation. It's actually, with the Russian mindset, it works the other way around. You don't, then you show weakness, so that's escalation. They will go more aggressively.
Yeah.
They double down. Now, mindful of our time, let's talk about the presentation I gave to Ukrainian business community when they asked me to, after the war, how to attract investments into Ukraine and so forth. In your capacity as advisor to Prime Minister, founder of Ukraine Invest, how do you see this war will end? I'm convinced that we will win. Ukraine will win. How the investment climate will work? The point I've been making to Ukrainian business community is that the help that's going to come from IMF, from governments, it's going to be great. More important is really to open the doors for private investments, meaning multinational companies building their manufacturing facilities, PE funds investments coming into the country. What's the environment? How people in Ukraine are thinking about this? Some reforms are already taking place. So can we talk about that?
And I'll just finish the last part because it's a great segue.
Sure, please.
But it's a great segue into this question. And that's probably the question I get asked the most in my presentations is, how does this end? What is victory? President Zelensky has said that victory is return to Ukraine's sovereign borders of 1991. It is the removal of the defeat of the Russian forces in Ukraine and their removal from the territory of Ukraine, a War Crimes Tribunal and Reparations Tribunal, focusing on the first two. The United States and its allies have said that victory for us is whatever the Ukrainians say that it's going to be. And okay, I want to hear from the president's mouth that victory means Ukraine's 1991 borders and that victory means the defeat of Russian forces in Ukraine and their removal from all of Ukraine's sovereign territory. If that's what he says victory is because of what Zelensky says. I would like to hear that made explicit. And I think all Ukrainians are waiting to hear that. And then what I want to see is the plan for how you resource and marshal the great resources that are still available in the US and in NATO at 50 cents a day, a limited time offer, to marshal those resources to get the job done this year. My view, and again, as a sort of student of history, is that, go back to the historians, not the political scientists, is that we will see if we marshal tanks, armor, HIMARS with the proper amount of ammunition, all of the kit that we can, that great mass of meat that they're throwing at us will collapse. Voltaire said, God doesn't take the side of the great battalion, the big battalions. God takes the size of those who shoot best. And 1905, 1917, the Russian army collapsed in disarray and was completely defeated. And especially in 1917, they had 4 million men under arms towards the end of the First World War. Soldiers just got so fed up with the conditions that they were in. They shot their officers, threw down their arms, and went home. And he doesn't have 4 million men today. And he's not going to find them. You're not going to find 4 million sober men in Russia to put on the front lines. And so I predict that if we have the kit that we have been promised, and if we get it so that we can launch a counteroffensive in April, May, you will see by late fall the collapse of the Soviet army, the Russian army in Ukraine. My prediction. Maybe aspirational, I don't know, but we can do it. So then what happens? We have to start thinking about what happens next after that. We're going to take an assumption that there's going to be $1 trillion available from various sources. 300, 400, 600 million from the Russians, and then others will pool over a period of time, not right away. So your question is, how do we attract foreign investment? So I put back on my Ukraine Invest hat, which I would love to do today, as opposed to having it in 2016 to 2019, where with most investors, I couldn't have a conversation with them because they couldn't find Ukraine on a map of Ukraine. And, but where I did actually have a conversation around was IT and innovation technology. And because they didn't know what Ukraine was, but they knew about something called Ukrainian IT engineers, who were the best of the best, because they were creative. You went through the system. You understand that it wasn't just about the mechanics. It was about coming to creative solutions, because Ukrainians have always had to bob and weave and find their way around the rules and around this unconventional ways of solving problems. And this cybernetics was basically, which is now part of the whole AI. Okay, I'm way out of my pay grade here, but that was founded in Ukraine, and we had 5 cybernetic institutes out of 6 or 7 out of in the Soviet Union, and those are still operating. So we're producing people. The opportunities, let's put it this way, are IT. Anything to do in the ag sector. I think this war, people have woken up to the fact that we feed 400 million people around the world. This is actually a big deal for everybody. Infrastructure, energy. I always wondered, how are we going to deal with these big Soviet energy systems? Well, now we know. They're not there to worry about. We have to rebuild from scratch. We're certainly not going to be rebuilding big generating stations again. For if nothing else, for security reasons. But it means that Ukraine will become an experimental place for a lot of innovation in terms of hydrogen and energy savings and other ways of doing things. Ukraine, so manufacturing, especially industry, call it 5.0 manufacturing, so the high-tech type of engineering and manufacturing that has to take place. So what are the conditions? Is Ukraine up to, ready for prime time? You've heard a lot about the corruption. You've heard of Ukraine is endemic corruption, it's rampant corruption, it's a failed state. Probably 70–80% of that was Russian propaganda that was pumping this out, that was picked up by all of the major Western news agencies. And went into this echo chamber that just fed this over and over and over again in this really pernicious feedback loop. I could not break it. And I was telling people, look, after the Maidan, we've created this fantastic, a unique anti-corruption architecture. We've got a national anti-corruption bureau. We've got a special anti-corruption prosecutor's office. We've got a special anti-corruption court. We've got one of the best transparent public procurement systems in the world. We even won an award for it. Can you believe it? You get an award for a public procurement system. That'd be an exciting evening. You have, all of our public data was put on the web, and so no country in the world had done more to transform its economy and to transform its transparency, accountability systems of governance than Ukraine had. I mean, we did the statistics, but we never got credit for it. It was always, yeah, but you haven't done this. Yeah, but you haven't done this. And that's especially from the EU. And I can say this in the United States, it wouldn't be very popular in Germany, but I kind of figured out in my conversations with these people what was going on. Keeping Ukraine in its place and saying, you're not ready yet, we'll tell you when you're ready, was a great way to continue doing business with Russia, because you couldn't do business with both. You couldn't have Ukraine join the EU and maintain your very favorable terms of your highly profitable relationship with the Russians. And that wasn't just gas.
Where corruption, by the way.
Off the charts. Yeah, a lot of property rights in Russia. Yeah, we've seen that. And so this was enormously frustrating. And so yet at the same time, we signed an EU-Ukraine association agreement that went a long way to actually jumpstarting the accession process. And so we had very significant regulatory convergence and regulatory compliance in a lot of different sectors. Laws were changed, regulations were adopted. So investors, when they started coming in the country, especially from the EU or from other countries where they had an EU presence, started saying, "Oh wow, okay, we get all this stuff. We have to deal with this garbage back home, but our lawyers understand it, our accountants understand it, our compliance officers understand it." And so we actually became a major part of the automobile, the other manufacturing supply chains. into Europe by the time of the war. All of that is still in place. And it will move now further faster because the continued reforms and the continued development of the Ukrainian economy are going to be made in the context, inevitably, of the accession to the EU through our candidate status. I never expected to see candidate member status in the EU in my lifetime, to be honest with you. And here we are. And war is a great accelerator of trends, some good, some bad. This is a virtuous one. And it's one that we need to take advantage of. We need to, but we cannot do it. As much as we love the IFIs or don't love the IFIs, they don't have enough on their balance sheet to make this work at the scale of reconstruction that has to take place. There is a private sector role to play. It's going to be an important one. I'm involved in a PPP project to build a highway from Rivne to Krakow. It's about 284 kilometers that just got green lighted by the government. And so that, you know, that's an important role. But whether it's the EIB, the World Bank, the IFC, the EBRD, they don't have the capacity to fund the whole thing. We are going to need sovereign and supra-sovereign support. So that's countries like the United States, like Great Britain, and supra-sovereigns like the EU to backstop. France has already set an example. It said to its French companies, we got your back. We will take political and military risk off the table. We will cover your investments. We'll guarantee them. That's a pretty good deal. I talked to DFC when I was in Washington recently, and you know, they've got $30 billion that they could put at stake. So we need governments to stand up and say to that's what I couldn't get in Ukraine Invest. I was fighting against the ultimate corruption in the EU, which is called state aid. You know, on the one hand, they're telling me, you know, yeah, you know, we're going to support you and your thing and your development and your accession to the EU, and at the same time, they're telling Korean and Japanese companies, you know, we'll pay 5 years of your capex we got covered, and we will subsidize you €1,000 per worker for the next 3 years. Meanwhile, the IMF is telling me, no, you can't have industrial parks, you can't have any privileged tax regime, etc., because you must collect every single tax dollar in order to get our IMF funding, which is a lifeline for us. I'm screwed. I mean, what do we do? And we could never break that Gordian knot. The war has done that. This is an opportunity for Ukraine, and I hope that I've seen it before, and I hope it doesn't happen, that Ukraine snatches defeat from the jaws of victory. I don't think it will happen, but it also means a new relationship with the EU. And the change in the EU by having Ukraine accede is going to be dramatic. That will shift in the balance of power, because Poland and Ukraine and now the Scandinavian countries are going to be a very significant bloc, and some of the Eastern European countries that will balance the Franco-German alliance. In fact, the French are actually looking at a much closer relationship with Ukraine now. It's going to have profound impact on energy, because we will, up until October 10th, we were a net energy exporter into the EU, of all things, during a war. And then they started bombing our energy infrastructure. But we'll get back there. You know, we'll get our power plant, our nuclear plants back, etc. And so there's going to be an entire new dynamic. And you know, I when I was at Ukraine Invest, I was always preaching about a European Ukraine. Now I think we're going to have to be looking at a Ukrainian Europe.
This is probably a good way for us to pause and maybe open it up for questions. Thank you, Dan. This has been a fascinating conversation, at least for me.
Happy to talk to any of your clients.
Yeah. John.
The issue of Crimea. So first of all, the fact that it was taken over with so little difficulty by the Russians and with so little international, reaction, and now its position, even if, let's say, the offensive and the Donbass is cleared out of Russian military, what is the next step for Crimea? Which, correct me if I'm wrong, George, and I apologize. I mean, not only do you have Russian speakers, but I believe the Russians have exported populations of ethnic Russia into Crimea, displaced local ethnicity, including Cossacks. So is that a step too far?
Well, no, I mean, we have to take Crimea because leaving the Russians in Crimea, I mean, aside from it means that our lifeline, our economic lifeline are the ports. And we are finding very challenging to move the amount of grain that we have to move, 100 million tons a year, by rail through other countries. It's just not feasible. So if he stays in Crimea, it means it's a threat to all of our vital ports and our economic lifeline. Strategically, it is not in NATO's interest because he projects power and threatens NATO countries, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, and effectively turning the Black Sea into a Russian lake, which cannot be in NATO's interests. And it gives him an opportunity to pause and to try to come back through. I think that we absolutely, I think there is a very strong possibility and probability that we will take Crimea. There are a number of chokeholds. I take out the Kerch Bridge, which if we get the medium range missiles that we've been promised from the US, we will be within range of the bridge, and we will be in range of basically controlling the entire access points to Crimea. And so you basically cut them off. We turn the water off. We turn all of the other access points off. And there are a number of ways you can invade it, you can siege it, you can do different things, but we have to take it back. It's absolutely crucial. Vis-a-vis what happens afterwards with the populations, etc. I have friends who have family in Crimea. They're not super happy. I got to tell you, there are people that are. You still have the old Soviet relics there that retired there after their military service, etc. That made up the real core. He has imported, but a lot of people have left. A lot of people have fled Crimea because they feel it's extraordinarily vulnerable. And our forces are doing everything possible to enhance that vulnerability and that sense of vulnerability using drones, both underwater drones as well as air drones, and partisan activity, which is increasing. So I think that the key part is to be very clear that we need to defeat the Russian army in Ukraine. And I think we need to stop obsessing about, well, if we do that, what if something happens in Russia? Get over it. There's nothing you can do to control what happens in Russia. It has its own dynamic. It has its own set of relationships. There is nothing you can do. You can guess. It could be a fun parlor game. You can, draw cards and see what comes up. I don't know if you've seen the movie Death of Stalin. I highly recommend it. It's a great movie. I mean, it just shows you what can happen after the death or the removal of a leader. It's a satire, but it's very prophetic.
It's very good.
Very prophetic. And what comes after Putin is probably going to be worse in many respects in terms of ideological outlook. But it may not matter because they will be very circumscribed in terms of what they can do. And that one person will not have a lock on power. There will be competing centers. And as George pointed out earlier, this is essentially, you may see the beginning of the decolonization of Russia. And that's something that we should be planning for in the West.
Yeah.
And it's something that we should be anticipating and welcoming because it's a process. Yeah, I mean, we don't want the repeat of George Bush Sr.'s Chicken Kiev speech, where he warned Ukrainians about suicidal nationalism. And, 7 months later, he was signing the recognition of an independent Ukraine. My prediction on the decolonization of Russia is you'll see the Caucasus go first. This is the soft underbelly of the Russian Empire. As soon as Kadyrov starts to sniff that Putin is weak, he'll declare himself the chieftain of an independent Chechnya, Dagestan, Tatarstan, Ingushetia, all these places you can barely pronounce are going to be are going to start to create this. Russia has always been plagued by centrifugal forces, and the only unifying feature has been repression. It's not even been economy. It's repression.
Repression.
And when people start, the point, this is what happened in the Soviet Union. You were there. And when people lose their fear of the system, you're done. It's the end of every dictator.
Yeah. And, to your point then on people are concerned, in the governments in the West that what's going to happen, disintegration of Russia. But it's the same as to say that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that people would be concerned about countries in Africa gaining their independence. It's the same. What you are seeing in Russia, it's exactly the same. You cannot say that, well, African countries should not have gained independence. They were gaining independence properly, and all these nations that have been colonized and suppressed and repressed, where people say that you have to speak Russian and not your language that you grew up with, that just cannot last. And John, to your point, I think that reintegrating Crimea will not be that difficult because a lot of people who were displaced out of Crimea, who cannot currently go to Crimea, live in Ukraine. They will likely go back, right? They want to go back. They have some family members who are there, right? And they cannot actually see each other. Those Russian families that were moved into Crimea, well, and they were given, by the way, for nothing, right? For free, plots of land of the people who owned
and the
apartments, homes. Yeah. Well, at some point, what they gotten illegally, effectively, they'll need to give up and go back, or they can settle, right? They can settle and live in Crimea. Nobody is going to be forcing them out the way I would predict it. But Crimea, there's also a geopolitical aspect to it. Crimea is no different from Donbass in a sense that it's Ukrainian territory. It's actually now, as lawyers speaking, right? There are a couple of treaties that specifically under which Russia recognized territorial borders of Ukraine that include Crimea. In 1991, there was a treaty on the dissolution of the Soviet Union that was signed in December of 1991, signed by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, recognizing each other's territorial integrity, which includes Ukraine. 1994 is even more important. Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons. And under that treaty, the Budapest Memorandum, Russia not only recognized territorial integrity, it promised and guaranteed that it will not use force or threat of force against Ukraine, which includes Crimea. So to leave Crimea in Russian hands, it's basically acknowledging that it's okay to go and violate international treaties, violate international law, just go grab some territory that you like. And it's wrong at many levels. So I think getting Ukraine...
And it creates moral hazard. Because if you let them in Crimea, then people will say, well, what about, Malorossiya, which is what they're calling, the word Little Russia, is what they're calling that strip of land that they control in the south now. And what about the Donbass? That was really never part of Ukraine anyway, which it was. And so there's lots of, you start to get into this moral equivalency, which is a very slippery slope. But there's a huge moral hazard here because you're condemning the Ukrainians who live in those areas to slavery and slaughter.
That's the biggest point, right? It's people who live in these occupied territories that now during this invasion, we're seeing that, when Russian troops leave, they leave behind dead bodies, they torture chambers, people who were raped. It's awful, right? And that's what people who are under occupation, that's what their destiny is. I'll let other people to ask questions, but one other aspect, John, that you asked, I just want to make sure that we touch on. There was little resistance when Crimea was taken over for a couple of reasons, the way I see it. One, it was a complete surprise. Ukraine was not ready. Ukraine, if you remember back then, it started in February. So after Maidan, Yanukovych, who was president, fled. And Ukraine was sort of caught in this environment where the president left the country. The protesters in Maidan were shot at. Ukrainian civil society was trying to reposition itself, getting ready for new elections. Russians come and go into Crimea, surprise. And I think Ukraine realistically was not ready for war at that time.
I'll give you the stats. In March of 2014, Ukraine Yanukovych basically stripped out $70 billion of the state treasury. So we had 5,000 US dollars in the government's current account. We had 6,000 battle-ready soldiers. We'd lost, 60% of the value of our currency. I mean, the country was just barely surviving. And we already had I was then the governor, the advisor to the governor of Donetsk Oblast, and we were already seeing that there were some preparations. The plan, this was deliberate, because Yanukovych had done a deal with Putin that what happened in Crimea was supposed to happen in March of 2015, when there was going to be the next presidential election scheduled. And the idea was that no matter whether Yanukovych won or lost, he'd still be there. And Crimea was the price. So the little green men, nobody plays, especially the Russians. You can't plan an operation like that in 2 weeks. Are you kidding? So this was actually planned, and they accelerated the planning. They took a big risk. And they bet on the fact that the West would do nothing. And this is actually the lesson, because the point you made, the fact that he got a little on the wrist for Crimea is why we're fighting a war now.
Yeah.
Is exactly the issue of appeasement.
Other questions?
So you mentioned Anne Apple, and she wrote at the time of President Biden when Kyiv visited President Zelensky that the significance of that visit was to communicate to Putin that exactly what he's been betting on, which is sort of quiet attrition and sort of the West waiting for the local disputes to resolve itself and everybody forgetting, and including the United States and other Western allies not coming through on their commitments on the remainder of the supplies and weapons. This was meant to be a message that the United States is not going to sort of give up on its commitments. The weapons are going to come through, and so no, Vladimir Putin is not going to win quiet war attrition. So assuming you agree with that assessment, and that's question number one. Do you agree with that conclusion? But assuming that you do, how does that play out? Is it simply, yes, the United States comes through, delivers on what it's committed, and the other Western allies, and then is it simply just more of the same for X number of months until he just runs out of men? And then what? He's left standing there essentially naked. It's not like he's going to say, okay, you've got me.
Right. Right. Both are excellent questions. The optics of support and the substance, to a large degree, have been great. We have had a real struggle over the last couple of months, just having enough ammunition. They're firing 60,000 shells at us a week, and we can fire 20,000 back. Now, we fire them a lot more accurately. They just spray the whole area. But we have no choice but to ration our response because we don't have enough to fight back on. Some of that's been addressed in the president's 2 latest packages. You'll see a very heavy emphasis on HIMARS ammunition and others. But it's been the stuff with the 155 millimeter shells and other basic bullets and things like that. We really need the longer range missiles. We really need the Patriots in. I realize that there is these time lags for training, et cetera, which is understandable. But these requests were made in July of last year. And, the fact that these decisions are taking place now means that lag time. Our guys train up really fast. We're learning combined arms training, which is really fundamental, how to use the artillery, the infantry, plus the armor, all at the same time. Bradleys are already coming in. They're much easier to learn how to drive and use, and they're very, very effective, apparently. Ukraine is definitely going to get into NATO. It's the only country in Europe that actually knows how to use everybody's systems. And not only knows how to use them, how to make them interoperable. The Americans have spent billions trying to make these systems interoperable. They still haven't figured it out. So we're going to have some patents to work on and sell to the U.S. So I think that there's a comfort that everybody got from this, and it was a very important move for the President Biden to make. But the commitments that are being made at Ramstein and the time deliveries that are being committed to are not being met, my understanding, and that's a big problem for us. because we lost the window to launch our counteroffensive in the winter, which my understanding was plan A. So now we have a much narrower window. We have to do it by April, May. And given the delivery issues, given the training issues, given the logistic issues, which include maintenance and everything else, because now we got to, we don't have bases to, a tank. American equipment, as great as it is not built to withstand the kind of intensity of barrage that we are using them for. So the metal cracks, you've got to replace the parts, etc. We have to ship these things back to Germany. We don't have bases in Ukraine to do it, to repair them. So they're trying to build forward bases in at least Poland or over the Ukrainian border. Maybe there's discussion with contractors. So, the way they did it in Iraq. So that leads to the second question. But it's not going to be more of the same. We're not going to fight a war of attrition. We have fought a war of attrition in Bakhmut for a strategic reason, and that is to degrade the enemy's military and their ability to advance further. It's cost us dearly. For every Ukrainian soldier, however, we've killed 5 Russian soldiers, 5 to 7, depending on whose statistics you believe. But they're sending the dregs of their society at us in this human wave of cannon fodder, grenade meat, we call it in Ukrainian. These are a lot of them are prisoners, and these aren't just like these aren't guys who are shoplifting. Okay, I mean these are murderers, rapists, pedophiles, cannibals, and
that's literally right. So most people probably have read it, right? That they are getting people out of prisons to send to Ukraine, right? It's actually not an exaggeration.
50,000, of which there are 10,000 still alive. So we have succeeded in doing this, and now there's the big question about the retreat. Is there going to be a retreat from Bakhmut or not? And if so, when? It's not the end of the world if we retreat from Bakhmut. We already have the second line of defense, and it's on higher ground. And my understanding is that we are confident that we can defend the line to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, which is crucial to protect. So the next phase is our counteroffensive. And that's where you need the armor and the ability and the people who shoot best, as Voltaire said, to be able to deal with what we're going to be facing, because they're dug in. They're dug in now. They're doing the defending. We're doing the advancing. And the only way we win is with superior equipment.
I'm mindful of time, but please. Please.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your service as a Ukrainian American and a member of a family proud Kyiv-based. Thank you. So my question pertains to a lot of experts and specialists have pointed out that Russian violence tends to come shortly after periods of political or economic instability. So, the second Chechen War, of course, after the first Chechen War, but also that was when Putin's regime began. You had the invasion of Georgia and South Ossetia that happened on the heels of the financial crisis. As you mentioned, taking over Crimea was also a move to access ports to sort of bolster the Russian economy. And now after sanctions from Crimea, Russia's found itself in another period of economic turmoil and has now invaded Ukraine. So I wanted to ask, aside from winning the war on the ground, of course, what do you see as the path forward in terms of preventing this sort of like eco hit of a protracted war that is supposed to be over in 3 days, and sort of stopping that from sort of feeding into another cycle and sort of getting at the hearts and minds of the Russian citizenry, sort of piercing through the propaganda that's sort of.
Yeah, I may be completely wrong, but I have no faith in piercing the hearts and minds of the Russian citizenry. The people that you could impact and that would come out to protest are all gone. These are all the IT, this is the entire brain drain that fled the country. I mean, more people left the country than invaded Ukraine. And these are the people that you need to not just economically, but even militarily. Like our entire IT industry is all in on the war. Used to be that you know, when you started, you had defended, you look for big strapping young men to go and be infantry. Well, those guys are now doing closed body support for, you know, the gamers and the geeks, who are the most sought after people in the Ukrainian military right now. And so, you know, I don't think about Russia almost at all, except in not very good terms. I read what I read in the Russian press in order to try to anticipate what might happen next, but that's more of an intellectual exercise, because you just don't know what they people write about has no bearing on what the decisions are going to be. They'll sort, you know, whatever happens, happens. We need to think about us. And the overriding issue coming out of this war is going to be Ukraine's place in the European economic and security architecture, EU and NATO. These have got to be the key. I mean, people say, well, you can't take Ukraine into NATO because Russia might invade. Okay, well, we got over that. Can you imagine if George Bush Jr. had succeeded in 2008 and Ukraine had become a member of NATO in a couple of years? Do you think we'd be here? You think we'd be having this discussion? Not a chance. Here's your answer, right? I mean, we're talking about security guarantees. We have nothing else to lose. You know, and nothing, all the red lines. You know, with each passing day, and if you defeat Russia and you defeat their ability to become an aggressor, it'll be decades before they can do this again. By then, the world moves on. You know, Russia becomes completely either falls apart or becomes a vassal state of China, which is that's the bigger geostrategic issue around this, is how do you deal with that? That's the other reason why America cannot afford to lose this war, because the message that it sends to China could be catastrophic for the United States. And so I don't really fuss about, you know, I think it was David Letterman asked Zelensky in that famous interview, you know, what do you
In the subway station.
Yeah, in the subway station. He said, you know, well, you know, what do you think about, you know, the next move of the Russians? And Zelensky goes, I couldn't care less. You know, because what are you going to do? You sweat what you can control. And the only thing we can control is what we do to the Russians in Ukraine.
So last question, Forrest.
Two quick questions. What's the controversy with the F-15, right? Does that escalate the war to a point where it's out of control? And can you talk a little bit about the leader of Wagner Group and the tension that's flowing between him and Kremlin?
Yeah, it's been a while since we spoke, so I don't know whether you know, I don't have any recent. I'm joking, of course. The F-16 debate, I frankly don't pay a lot of attention to it, because I think that it will come eventually. You know, it's not like you hand the keys to a new car and say, take it out for a spin. I mean, our guys have to learn not just, you know, they can fly them, right? It's how you do all the maneuvers and everything else. It takes time. There are reports that Ukrainian pilots are currently being trained.
Yeah.
But this is not a quick fix. This is not we'll bring them in as part of the advance in May. I mean, I'd be far more interested in us getting whatever MiG-29s are left in the arsenals of NATO countries and get them into Ukraine. And then, you know, they buy F-35s down the road, etc. I mean, you know, full disclosure, I don't own any defense industry shares, but man, I'm starting to look at them. That's the other big upside for the US, is we're going to see a big ramp up in the defense industrial base in this country and in others for many years. Even, you know, they're now, because, you know, the supplies have been drawn down. So now countries are, especially the United States, but also Germany and other countries, are pooling cash to pay, you know, Lockheed, BAE, Rheinmetall, pay them to produce new equipment for Ukraine directly. And again, but that's a lag time. That doesn't happen overnight. So I don't think that the F-16 issue is another escalation. It's like escalation is a four-letter word to me. It all comes down to the issue of fear. You can be risk adverse totally and say, anybody who's got a nuclear weapon, we will not do anything. Wow, what a message. The Iranians will go all out. They know there's no downside to them acquiring a bomb because they will be able to stand the US down. I mean, that would be just the most disastrous policy in the world. So be risk informed, right? And Putin as a KGB agent is brilliant at weaponizing fear. And he's done that. And every time people say, oh, we can't do that, we're going to send them a message, we're not going to escalate. You said it best. He goes, yeehaw, double down. You know, throw some more drones and rockets at the cities. You know, we're not going to do anything to us. This is the only thing you understand. So I think you have to deal with these fears. And if you can harness that, then you can actually make informed decisions about risk, as opposed to being paralyzed by this corrosive notion of fear. Prigozhin, I mean, you know, it's kind of fun to watch this. It's like a daily soap opera. Somebody takes a shot at Lavrov or at Shoigu. Shoigu takes a shot at Prigozhin. You know, at the end of the way, my takeaway is, how much is this really a destabilizing factor inside the Russian power structure, or not? Because these guys are bit players. The hard men around Putin are people who aren't even in the government. And these are his closest friends and advisors from St. Petersburg. There are people like Patrushev. There are who is the head of the FSB, former KGB. I mean, these are the people that call the shots. And at what stage are their interests so affected, or they see Putin so weakened? This is why Bakhmut for Putin is existential. Another reason why we're holding it, because every day he doesn't take it, you know, it's the power starts to, you know, the people start to go, well, maybe he's not all that powerful. Maybe he's not all that. And somebody once said there is no louder sound than the hissing of power leaving the balloon. And this is a big concern of his. He has given them to the end of March to take the entire Donbass. I mean, they're not anywhere close to taking the entire Donbass. And they can't under the current, they'd have to mobilize more men. They don't have as much ammunition. Our guys have said, as bad as the reign of death is, it's a lot less than it was 2 months ago. I mean, I was losing friends, I've been to 7 funerals in my own village, and 3 of them were from Bakhmut in 1 week over Christmas. You know, and it was December and January, just awful months for us. But you know, they're struggling as well. Their defense industrial base has been degraded tremendously. It was never great to begin with. It was very inefficient. They didn't produce great stuff. But you know, all you need is something to explode at the end of the day. But a lot of smart people left, as we just discussed. You know, alcoholism and productivity has always been an issue with the Russians. And you know, the more alcoholics running a tank factory, you know, better it is for us on the production lines. You know, this stuff doesn't work, and it gets repaired. So I don't really pay, frankly, a lot of attention to that, other than, you know, it's kind of interesting to hear what that idiot has to say, you know, every couple of days.
So then, thank you very, very much. Most enjoyable conversation for me. Thank you for everything you've been doing for Ukraine at every level. Truly amazing, and you know, I am grateful, and well, you know, everybody grateful. And thank you for staying with us for so long.
And I want to thank you, George, for giving me this opportunity, and for your comments. I mean, it's we got to do this. We got to take this on the road. And to all of you for your support. I you know, in all honesty, it is so important. And you know, even personally, I mean, I live in a bubble, and I don't have a lot of context unless I actually meet and see people, which happens you know, not with great frequency, but you don't really understand what you read. You know, people are getting tired of Ukraine, and there's fatigue and all this kind of stuff, and that's a big concern. That's why I keep doing these things. And you know, the fact that you folks took some time out today, I don't know who they're going to bill this to, but the set up a special file or something. But that's real sign of commitment, and that when I meet with people like yourselves, it really makes a big difference. Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini. Героям слава. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.